Time to go back to the beginning.
Yeah, it's rewind time.
Today we are ranking the foundational death metal albums of the 80s, starting with Possessed with Seven Churches in 1985. Possibly my all-time favorite fusion of death and thrash metal, and really setting the stage for bigger albums to come in the following years. If you ask me, every single track on here is pure destruction, starting strong with The Exorcist and Pentagram, and then continuing into other headbangers like Burning in Hell, Seven Churches, and the appropriately titled closer, Death Metal. Notably, some of the guitar work is provided by Larry Lalonde, who some of you may also know from another little band called Primus. Amazingly, Lalonde and vocalist Jeff Becerra were only 16 when making this record. I can't think of anything of real importance I did at 16, and these guys were out here helping to invent an entirely new genre. So yeah, this is going to fantastic.
I'm talking about hardcore death metal.
Moving into 1986, we have Poison with Into the Abyss. This album came recommended by longtime viewer and Discord mod Zucchini, German death thrashers with their only full length after a long series of demos. Definitely plenty of comparisons here to Sodom, Sarcofago, and Possessed. Solid listen, not the heaviest thing here by a long shot, but it's fast and furious at 33 minutes. I ended up putting it at good tier, but it's probably like my least listened album on this list, so that could change. Then we have Sepultura with Morbid Visions. The debut album of this band, now largely known for thrash and groove, but this first record did a lot for both death and black metal as well. Max has said they didn't even fully tune their guitars and knew very little English, so lyrics were translated word for word. It's got a unique, cavernous atmosphere that allows it to stand out, in my opinion. And as someone who digs that, I'd say its shortcomings end up becoming a strength in a way, making this still one of my favorite albums from them overall. It is going to amazing. Then we have Possessed back with Beyond the Gates. After loving the debut, I find this follow-up to be kind of disappointing in a number of ways. For one, it feels a bit thrashier and less death metal from Seven Churches, both in the guitar work and vocals. They do play around more with songwriting, technical elements, and overall dynamics and variety, but to pretty inconsistent results, and at the loss of much of the bloodlust I love about the debut. I also feel like the production is actually worse on this one, feeling less cavernous and more like a stark tin can garage recording. It's certainly not without its moments, but I revisit this one far less than the others, so it's going to okay. Then we have Messiah with Hymn to Abramelin. The debut album from the Swiss death thrash band we covered quite a bit in the 90s videos that you should also check out. Pretty grimy stuff, similar in many ways to, again, Possessed, but also some doomier stuff similar to Autopsy with tracks like Space Invaders, which admittedly are not my favorite moments. Wicked riffing and chaotic vocals are greatly complemented by stark, cavernous, reverb-heavy production. Really cool to hear this band start in comparison to where they end up going in the 90s. I ended up putting this one at great tier. Yo, we have plenty more albums to go, but as usual, if you're enjoying the video so far, be sure to hit the like button and comment your favorites, your least favorites. Where do you agree? Where do you disagree? Let's get a conversation going down there. And I do videos like this 2 or sometimes 3 times a week at this point, so be sure to subscribe if you're new here and you want more of this. But next up, we're moving into 1987 with Necrophagia with Season of the Dead.
Conscious spirituals many choose not to believe. Mystical visions start to appear. Motionless poised reaction, controlled by eternal fear.
Album number 1 for this Ohio band, focused on horror and gore. Definitely one of the more traditional sounding death metal albums on this list, holding on to some thrash influences, but also helping to pave the way for especially the Florida sound, I would say. Good use of pace changes in both D-beat driven sections and more plotting ones like Painful Discharge that also bring a bit more atmosphere. I also love the sound of the bass on this album, especially on tracks like Terminal Vision. This one also landed at great tier. Then we have another one from Messiah with Extreme Cold Weather. Now, while I do like the icy cold vibes of this album, I don't like it as much as the debut. The riffs and vocals feel more heavy metal and speed metal inspired, and then things get downright weird with the spoken word elements. It's like a more avant-garde version of Venom, which sounds like that could be interesting, but I'm just not really that into it. They also allude to a bit more of the band's later, more progressive elements, but the execution feels kind of clunky here, so just landed at okay. Then we have Sarcofago with I.N.R.I. More grimy Brazilian metal that straddles the line of death and thrash metal while also providing inspiration for, again, early black metal stuff. Great opener with Satanic Lust setting a sufficiently evil tone that carries into the others, like the blackened title track, complete with ominous claps of thunder. Also dig the ripping Satanus and death thrash. Others, like Nightmare, feel a little stretched and monotonous, but not horribly so. Not as strong as their next album, The Laws of Scourge, but a strong debut nonetheless. This one also went to great tier. And then we have Death with Scream Bloody Gore. Still often pointed to as the first true death metal record, thanks in no small part to Chuck's demented vocals and guitar work. There's still plenty of thrash influence on the raging tremolo picking, but then you've got more doomy, atmospheric stuff like Zombie Ritual. And Chris Reifert's drumming here would very much carry on into his work with Autopsy. Other killer tracks include Infernal Death, Evil Dead, and the closing title track. You know this one has to go to perfection. Moving to 1988, we have Bolt Thrower with In Battle There Is No Law. This is the lowest audience-rated album from these UK legends on Metal Storm, and I just think that could not be more wrong, personally. It's just so gritty and grimy, and the vocals sound like they're from some creature that crawled out of the sewer. Good mix of hardcore, grindcore, and death metal with a very cavernous, echoey mix. Songs average from around 3 minutes for a total runtime of just over 30, which feels perfect for this style. And I love just how heavy and ridiculous it sounds. Like, just so cacophonous and with all this aggression. Honestly, in some ways, I'd compare it, again, to Possessed. I'm going to put this one at amazing. Then we have Carcass with Reek of Putrefaction. The debut album from this UK band and constant stylistic chameleons. To be precise, this album is also more kind of gore grind than death metal, but I think it's certainly got enough of these shared elements to warrant inclusion on this list. Guitarist Bill Steer has stated that the studio engineer basically ruined the record with its pretty famously awful production, but it was interesting this time around to listen to the full range edition, which is a decent upgrade. Definitely still grimy stuff with chaotic guitars, pretty sickening vocals on tracks like Carbonized Eye Sockets. One of my least favorite works from them overall, but it has its place in metal history, so went to good tier. Then we have Death again with Leprosy. Scott Burns Engineering making for a shift in sound from the last one among the first, stating what would become known as the death metal sound. Bill Andrews stepping in on drums and Rick Rawes on guitar, both of whom would later join Massacre. Great musicianship, picking up largely where Scream Bloody Gore left off, but also broadening out with more dynamics and complexity. The songwriting feels a bit more mature without losing the intensity. I go back and forth between the debut and this one, and it's a strong one in its own right with headbangers like the title track, Born Dead, Left to Die, and of course, Pull the Plug. This one also ended up going to perfection. Then we have Pestilence with Malleus Maleficarum. A ripper of a debut from this Dutch band here with Martin van Drunen, later of Asphyx, and a number of other projects on vocals. Definitely a shredder wearing their thrash metal influences on their sleeve with this one. Start to finish rager, but with some standouts like Cycle of Existence, Parricide, Systematic Instruction, and Subordinate to the Domination. Still one of my favorites from them to this day, sometimes even more so than its arguably more famous follow-up that we will get to, but it went to fantastic. And then we have Morbid Angel with Altars of Madness. The legendary debut from this Florida band, and you can bet Mad Mike is watching right now to see where I put this one. Love the creepy synth and overall malevolent tone of the opener Immortal Rites. The combination of David's vocals and Trey's guitar work truly makes for one of the most evil sounding records of the decade alongside Slayer. Also love Suffocation, Maze of Torment, Damnation, and more spooky synths and crazy blast beats on Chapel of Ghouls. I'll admit that it took me a while to really get into this album despite its classic status, and I'm still Team Domination overall, but of course within the scope of when it was released and its overall legacy paired with how much fun I had with it this time, of course this one also had to go to Putrefaction.
Boy, you had me worried there for a minute.
And then moving into 1989, we have Blood with Impulse to Destroy. The debut album from this German band with an emphasis on grindcore, especially with some of these shorter songs here that clock in at under a minute. But then the longer songs, and I'm stretching that term considering that the longest song here is only about 4 minutes, are D-beat head bobbers not dissimilar from the likes of Autopsy. Definitely making some comparisons to Empatigo as well, with arguably the weirdest vocals on this list, which I suppose is to be expected from a frontman who credits himself as Chicken. A little repetitive, but not without its moments, but it ended at okay tier. Then we have Defecation with Purity Dilution. Another debut album, this from this death and grind band out of Las Vegas with Mick and Mitch Harris of Napalm Death fame. The speed and chaotic hardcore punk energy are definitely on the grindcore side, but the heaviness still leans into death metal. Another one that gets a little repetitious at times, but does a better job, I would say, than Blood overall. So it went to good tier. Then we have Bolt Thrower back with Realm of Chaos, Slaves to Darkness. Great opener with Eternal War, and I also dig the guitar tone on this one. I'd personally argue that this has some of the best hooks of their discography, like the slimy groove that opens through the Eye of Terror, or the sort of Seasons in the Abyss sounding Plague Bearer. Still plenty of grime and grittiness to tracks like Realm of Chaos. All That Remains just sounds like it's on fire all around everywhere. Nice battering mix of blast beats and groove, as well as some really great build-ups too on tracks like World Eater. Pretty strong album. It's going to fantastic. Then we have Obituary with Slowly We Rot. Strong start with a real classic here from this Florida band, and John Tardy's vocals are absolutely demented, making him sound like some rabid zombie. Solid atmosphere, also takes simple riffs a long way with even slower ones like Till Death, seriously head bob inducing. Really strong production I'd put on the same level as Death. It does get a little slow in places, and definitely I prefer the faster, thrashier stuff like Intoxicated, but overall this is pretty excellent. Many people here prefer Cause of Death, but personally I think this is the superior listen. This one ended up at amazing. Then we have Autopsy with Severed Survival. Autopsy formed soon after drummer-vocalist Chris Reifert left Death to form this project with Eric Cutler and Steve DiGiorgio on bass here, which again makes it all the more of a shame that I hate the bass tone on this recording, unfortunately. This album owes quite a bit of its sound to a similar style as early Death, right down to their very horror and gore-oriented lyrics and imagery, but with a healthy dose of doom as well. You've got faster, skankier stuff like Charred Remains, but also slower ones like Service for a Vacant Coffin and Disembowel. Again, not a big fan of doom, which puts this lower for me, but I do dig the faster parts and the alternate album art that we're using here with the 3 surgeons. So we're going to good tier. Then we have Pestilence with Consuming Impulse. Martin's last album with the band before guitarist and current vocalist Patrick Spacey Boy Mameli took over. Moving into a more overtly death metal direction with more emphasis on groove, another banger with more great tracks like Dehydrated, The Process of Suffocation, Suspended Animation, and Chronic Infection. Also love the occasional synth elements and some pretty ripping solos from Patrick too, and I put this album art as another like top 10 classic for the genre. It went to fantastic. Then we have Terrorizer with World Downfall. Another death and grindcore band, this one out of Los Angeles, and another of the first produced with the help of Scott Burns. The lineup features Oscar Garcia of Nausea and the late Jesse Pintado of Brujeria, Lockup, and Napalm Death, and both Pete Sandoval and David Vincent of Napalm Death for even more death metal cred. Super aggressive stuff with pretty solid pacing too, slowing things down just long enough to keep those blasts and D-beats sounding fresh. I'm not the biggest grindcore lover outside of a few bands like Pig Destroyer and Napalm Death, but I definitely enjoyed what this was serving up for the most part, so it went to great tier. Then we have Carcass with Symphonies of Sickness. Moving from the grindier influences of the debut towards a more overtly death metal approach, you've still got breakneck blasters like Reek of Putrefaction, but also slimier, groovier stuff like Exhumed to Consume and Ruptured in Purulence. Plenty of solid tracks, though I will say they hadn't quite developed the songwriting chops yet to fully carry some of the runtimes that move past the 4 and 5 minute territory. I'm a huge fan of Carcass and enjoy this album quite a bit, but it's not really until the next record that they become really start to finish killers for me. But still, great album nonetheless. It is going to amazing. And then we have Atheist with Piece of Time. Depending on where you hail from, you may not have seen this record until 1990, but within the US it was released in 1989, already the beginning of a short but incredibly impressive discography, one where each record feels very ahead of its time. Just jumping straight into more of a progressive death metal style right from the start before Death, Carcass, or Pestilence really would. The title track sets that high bar right from the top and never really lets up from there. Also love On They Slay. And I appreciate this debut in that while it doesn't quite get as experimental as the ones that follow, it's also probably the heaviest one, with plenty of the thrashier guitars alongside the more complex and technical arrangements. In that way, I might also compare this to the likes of Sadist, Toxic, and Coroner. Roger Patterson's bass work is also a huge highlight for me here, and it went to perfection. Y'all check out this playlist for my rankings of more 90s death metal albums by each year, or this video for something completely different. Again, comment below your favorites, like if you enjoyed it, but that'll do for now. Flight of Icarus signing off. I will see you in the trenches.